Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: daring ideas are like chessmen moved forward. They may be beaten, but they may start a winning game. From the German poet, playwright, novelist, scientist and amateur artist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. A brief review of the last part, where we continued our study of Chapter 2, the doubled pawn and restraint, Part 2 of the book, Position Play, and continued discussing the topic, the most familiar doubled pawn complexes, with illustrations from Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch continues the discussion under the topic of the most familiar doubled pawn complexes and writes: on the other hand, we hold the development d5 by black to be barred, since it may easily provoke sinister restraints. In this connection, the game Bilkard vs. Bernstein, Ostend 1907 is very instructive. Maurice Bilkard was a French chess master who played around the turn of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch continues: after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, d6, d4, e takes on d4, knight takes on d4, bishop d7, castling, bishop e7, bishop takes on c6, b takes on c6, d3, castling, bishop b2 and d5. There followed e5, knight e8 and queen d2. White rightly thinks that black's doubled pawns will not get any stronger by advancing. c5, knight e2, c6, rook d1, queen c7, knight f4 and queen b7. Knight takes on d5 was threatened here. So queen b7 and knight a4. This move ushers in a blockade by the occupation of the point c5. It would be still worse for black were his pawns at c7, c6 and d5. The effect then of a knight at c5 would be simply crippling. This game is intended to help bring out the affinity between the doubled pawns and restraint, to which allusion or a passing reference was made at the beginning of this chapter. c4, bishop d4, c takes on b3 and a takes on b3 question mark. C takes on b3 seems more logical. So a takes on b3, knight c7, knight d3, knight e6, knight c5, queen c7, knight takes on d7, queen takes on d7, queen e3, knight takes on d4, queen takes on d4, rook b8, knight c5, queen f5 and knight d3. White dominates the point c5, but had he on his 18th move played c takes on b3, the pressure in the open c file would have been appreciably strengthened. With this, d5 by black on the 10th move seems to be refuted. The student who is interested in the deeper logical connections will now say to themselves how easy the complex c7, c6 and d5 must be to blockade. For black succeeded in undoubling the pawns. In addition, white made a serious mistake. A takes on b3 instead of c takes on b3. and yet the mobility of black's pawns at c6 and d5 remained as slight as it was before. This calculation is in fact correct. The pawns at c7, c6 and d5 are very susceptible indeed to blockade infections. In other words, the affinity between the double pawns and restraint, which we emphasized at the beginning of this chapter, may already be accepted as probable. As we go on, the probability is likely to be turned into a certainty. Reference game number 12 of the illustrative game section, Leonhardt versus Nimzowitsch. Please note that this game was covered in part 11 of this video series. Viewers interested in going through the game again can find that part of the video series in the playlist. Moving further, Nimzowitsch begins the next topic of discussion under the heading number 3, restraint. The mysterious rook moves, on true and spurious or false freeing moves, and how they are to be combated. Nimzowitsch writes, in the position on board, white clearly intends to play d4 at any moment when this move seems feasible. Black's rook e8 is intended to help make this freeing move difficult of execution for all time. We have here therefore to do with a preventive action. Hence, it is only the outer form of the move which is mysterious. That is, a rook to seize a file which is still closed. Its strategical end is not as mysterious. This position is taken from the game Blackburne versus Nimzowitsch played in 1914, and Nimzowitsch writes of the position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. Black makes the mysterious rook move, rook e8. The rook's function is here to act as a preventive against d4 by white. Nimzowitsch continues, to demand of a piece only direct attacking activity is the stamp of the mere wood shifter. The keener chess mind quite rightly demands of the pieces that they also undertake preventive action. The following situation is typical. A freeing action, usually a pawn advance planned by our opponent, would in the result give us an open file. This potential file to open, which does not lie in our power, we nevertheless seize and in advance, with the idea of giving our opponent a distaste for the freeing action. The mysterious rook move is an indisputable ingredient of a rational strategy. We will give some examples. Consider the position on board. The position is a constructed one in the opening stage of a game, and white plays rook f to d1. That is to say, white expects c5 to be played at an opportune moment and intends in this case, after d takes on c5, b takes on c5, to take advantage of the c and d files to bring pressure on the resulting hanging pawns c5 and d5. The mysterious rook move is generally an affair of the opening, though in the early stages of the middle game it also plays an important role. In the position on board, black coolly plays rook a7. If white now plays a3, then rook a8, and now white can only realize their plan to play b4 and c5 at the cost of certain concessions to their opponent. The continuation might, for instance, be rook a7, a3, rook a8, queen b2, queen d8, b4, a takes on b4, a takes on b4, queen b8, rook takes on a7 question mark, queen takes on a7, black keeps control of the a file. Or rook b1, king f8, c5, b takes on c5, rook takes on a7, rook takes on a7, b takes on c5, queen takes on b2, rook takes on b2, rook a3, rook c2, bishop c8, and c6. Best. Not, however, c takes on d6. C takes on d6, knight b5, rook a1 check, king f2, bishop a6, and the game is about equal. So c6 and knight e8, followed by f5 with some counterplay. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. Black tries by rook a7 and rook a8 to prevent white's plan of a3, b4 and c5, or at worst to lessen the effect of white's advance. Nimzowitsch continues, a further example, the position on board is taken from an actual game, Kupchak versus Capablanca, Lake Hopart Kong, 1926. After white's 19th move, the position shown on board was reached. Abraham Kupchak was an American chess master who played in the 20th century. Nimzowitsch continues. The pawn chain calls for a black attack on its base, the white pawn at c3, by a6, b5, a5, and b4. But it is necessary for black to safeguard himself against g4. With this idea, black played h5, rook f1, and rook h6, double exclamation mark. The mysterious rook move, for black sees white's h3 and g4 coming and wishes when this happens to be ready to attack in the h file. Bishop e1, g6, bishop h4, king f7, queen e1, and a6, now timely. Bishop a4, b5, bishop d1, bishop c6, and rook h3. Instead, a defensive move on the queen wing was here indicated for white. a5, bishop g5, rook h8. Queen h4, b4, and queen e1, or bishop f6 and bishop e7. So queen e1, rook b8, rook f3, a4, and black pushed his attack home. Rook f2, a3, b3, c takes on b3, bishop takes on b3, bishop e5, rook g1, queen takes on c3, and so on. The rook maneuver in this game, rook f6 to h6 to h8, stands out with plastic effect and must give pleasure to anyone who plays over the game. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. Black, Capablanca, starts a preventive action against white's g4 and carries it out with great virtuosity or skill. His mysterious rook moves are masterly. Nimzowitsch continues. In the position on board from the game Von Gottschall versus Nimzowitsch, played in Hanover 1926, Black wanted to take advantage of his majority on the king's side by the maneuver king to g6 to f5, followed by e5. Hermann von Gottschall was a German chess master and an author who played around the turn of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch continues. However, on king g6, white would play g4. Therefore, I chose the mysterious rook move, rook h8, and after the further moves, rook d1, king g6, rook d4, king f5, and bishop d2, there again followed a mysterious rook move, rook f8, which we might more accurately call semi-mysterious, for whereas rook h8 followed merely preventive ends, rook f8 has this essential difference that its nature is purely active. There followed bishop e1, e5, f takes on e5, f takes on e5, rook h4, g5, rook b4, king e6 discovered check, king e2, e4, bishop f2, and rook f3. The passed pawn, the penetration of the rook into the enemy position, and a certain weakness in white's c-pawn slowly wrought the destruction of white's game. See part 2 of the book, chapter 6, topic number 3, where the interesting ending of this game is given. Interesting because of the tactics employed to break down white's resistance by maneuvering against both flanks. Please note, we will go through this game ending as we move further into the book. Nimzowitsch continues. The mysterious rook move places a rook in a closed file, which can only be opened by the enemy themselves, and if they do not do so, our rook is standing there with nothing doing. Such a move must never be made, except consciously and with the intention of sacrificing something of the rook's effective strength. The sacrifice is made in order to prevent an enemy freeing maneuver, or at any rate to render it difficult. If, however, we recognize a freeing move planned by our opponent as illusory, as not really having a freeing effect, then it would be in the highest degree uneconomical to make such a sacrifice. In the game which was quoted previously, Blackburne versus Nimzowitsch, difference between a true and illusory freeing move leaps to the eyes, and it is also pertinent to our conception of prophylactic strategy. We give it in full in the game section of the book. See game number 32. The student is recommended to play it over before proceeding further. Alright, then let's go through this game. It was played between Joseph Henry Blackburne versus Aron Nimzowitsch at the St. Petersburg tournament in 1914. St. Petersburg, Russia, then the Russian Empire. Joseph Henry Blackburne was a British chess player who played around the turn of the 20th century. His brilliant play during the Vienna tournament of 1873 earned him the nickname the Black Death. Blackburne was regularly one of the world's top 5 chess players in the 1870s and 1880s. Nimzowitsch writes of the game as follows. In the following game, we have an instance of a mysterious rook move, also a striking example of the difference between a true and false freeing move. As this game in addition illustrates very clearly our conception of prophylactic strategy, it is inserted here. Blackburne with the white pieces and Nimzowitsch with the black. Notes by Aron Nimzowitsch. E3, D6, F4, E5, F takes on E5, D takes on E5, Knight C3 and Bishop D6. Nimzowitsch comments, the best move for the early development of the knights advocated by Lasker would not get at the root of the matter here. This root lies in the pawn configuration and in the prevention of any freeing pawn moves. E4 and Bishop E6, preventing Bishop C4. Knight F3 and F6. Black plays, as will become evident at his 8th move, to prevent the advance of the d pawn to d4, which would in a certain sense have a freeing effect, since it would make white's majority in the center felt. Black, as he plays it, succeeds in completely crippling the enemy majority in the center, and now the reader may ask, why does Black give white the opportunity of playing d4 on his 7th move? D3. White forgoes the advance, and rightly, for d4 here would be the typical false liberating move, which merely creates new weaknesses. For example, d4, knight d7 and d5. Otherwise, ultimately e takes on d4 with play against white's isolated e pawn. So d5, bishop f7, followed by the occupation of the point c5 by bishop or knight. As such, d3 was played by white in the game, and play continued with knight e7, bishop e3 and c5. With the aid of the resources he has in the d-file, Black now succeeds in forcing his opponent to act on the defensive. See Black's 9th and 10th moves. Queen d2, knight c6, bishop e2, knight d4, castling, castling, knight d1, knight c6 and c3. Nimzowitsch writes, the reward which Black's systematic scheme of operations has earned for him. White's pawn at d3 is now a weakness. Knight takes on e2 check, queen takes on e2 and rook e8, the mysterious rook move, which in the event of white playing d4 threatens to make things uncomfortable for him in the e-file. In addition to this, it makes room for the bishop at f8, to which square the latter wishes to go. Knight h4, bishop f8, knight f5 and king h8. White has made pertinent use of the open f-file, his one advantage. Black's move, for all its unpretentiousness or modesty, has its significance in position play. Black ensures the eventual possibility of playing g6 and f5 without being disturbed by a knight check at h6. g4 and queen d7 renders possible a parry to the ever-threatening advance g5. For example, g5, g6, knight g3 and f5 with an excellent game for black. Reference to the previous note. So queen d7, knight f2 and a5. White's a pawn is constantly threatened, and if b3, a4 by black will now be possible. It is evident that White's queen's wing is sympathetically affected by the weakness of his center. a3 and b5. Instead, bishop b3 would have been a strong move here, although by it, black would have to forego the parry he had planned to g5 by white. Nevertheless, bishop b3 could have composedly been played. One should not be a slave to one's parries. Bishop b3, g5, f takes on g5, bishop takes on g5, and c4. Lasker's suggestion. D takes on c4, queen e6, knight e3, queen g6, queen g4, bishop c5, and black wins. Or queen f3 instead of knight e3. Bishop takes on c4, rook d1, and black has a slight advantage. So b5, rook d1 and rook b8. Some tempi could have been saved instead by playing b4 at once. So rook b8, rook d2, b4, a takes on b4 and a takes on b4. If c takes on b4, d4. So a takes on b4 and c4. Black ought now to play out his trumps. Rook a8 question mark. Black had brought about a strategically won position. Only he should not have delayed any longer playing out his trumps. These consisted of knight d4, which would lead to bishop takes on d4, and of g6 and bishop h6 in order to dominate the diagonal. Thus, g6 instead of rook a8. Knight g3, knight d4, bishop takes on d4 and c takes on d4, followed by bishop h6. Or queen d1 instead of exchanging, and rook a8 followed by queen a4. The exchange of queens will be forced and black has a good endgame. He could also play out his trumps in the reverse order. Knight d4 instead of g6. Bishop takes on d4, c takes on d4, queen f3, best, g6, knight g3, queen e7, knight d1, bishop h6, rook g2 and bishop g5, followed by rook a8 to a1 and so on. So rook a8, queen f3 and rook a2 question mark. There was still time for knight d4 instead. So rook a2 and g5. Thanks to a tactical sally or sudden charge, white's 26th move. This thrust, which was thought to have been prevented, is now after all possible. g6 and knight g4 robs black of the fruits of his deep plan of campaign. There followed g takes on f5, knight takes on f6, knight d4 and queen f2. Queen h5 instead would have won more quickly. So queen f2, queen c6, knight takes on e8, queen takes on e8, bishop takes on d4, e takes on d4, e takes on f5, and white won easily. What we have to learn from this game is the ability to distinguish between true and false freeing moves. The manner in which black was able to hold in check the thrusts d4 and later until the moment of aberration or abnormality g5 is worthy of special notice. Reference to discussion before this game. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowicz's My System here, and we shall continue onwards from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Several new supporters: Mr. Slowhandgrind, Purple Fair, Trichdaydream, CookingRooks, Shahan Ba, Staccato or Vibrato, and Shakopa. Shahan Ba is an occasional chess streamer. Shakopa also has a stream where he streams chess in German. I will post a link to their streams in the video description. Do check out their channels. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.